Welcome back to the Dietitians and Nutrition Support. As a continuation of our enteral nutrition series, I wanted to talk a little bit more about how we might transition a patient from a continuous enteral feed to a bolus enteral feed, meaning that they previously were on a pump or a hanging bag that would allow for them to get a continuous flow of formula over a period of time throughout the day, versus moving to a bolus formula, or a bolus dosage, I should say, of formula. That would be a larger number of milliliters at strategic points throughout the day to provide the patient with enough calories, energy, protein, all those pieces, but to give them a little bit more freedom from a pump or a hanging bag. So let's go ahead and get started on those calculations and see what that might look like with a patient who's transitioning from continuous to bolus enteral feeds.
So our patient today is named Mr. B. Mr. B is a 76-year-old gentleman who's approximately 5'8" and 158 pounds, or about 72 kilos. This patient is listed as edentulous. When a patient is edentulous, that means they have some or all missing teeth, and I would expect for the most part that you'd want to confirm with the patient whether or not they are edentulous, and also follow up with them to see whether or not they have dentures that are fitting and that they utilize when eating. You'll find many different patients that have certain feelings about their dentures, whether they like or dislike them, and choose or don't choose to use them. It does not always lead to poor intake, but for this patient, they are listed as having limited oral intake. So that's likely going to lead us all the way to this third point here, saying that they're PEG tube dependent. So currently this patient is being fed through the PEG tube primarily, and is also getting a continuous rate of formula through that PEG tube. You can see in the last bullet point here at the top that this patient has type 2 diabetes. I don't have it listed here that the patient is on any specific oral medications or if they're insulin dependent, but it does say that they're on a consistent carbohydrate diet, which is obviously going to be an important factor in determining how we provide our formulas to this patient today. So as we look to the needs column, I just gave us the needs for us today. So if you were to be calculating those, there's many ways to do it, but we're not going to spend our time on that today. So I will just give you the needs here. So the needs here have the calories 1,700 to 1,800 a day, protein at 75 to 90 grams, and carbohydrates at 150 to 175 grams a day. So those are going to be an important piece for us to reflect back on after we do a little consideration here of the current enteral and oral prescription. So some things about this patient that we can look back on. Remember, they were PEG tube dependent, and they also have limited oral intake. For this patient, it's likely that they eat just for pleasure. If the patient doesn't have any major swallowing issues or something in their chart that's indicating that they're non-safe or not able to consume food, most of the time they'll let patients have, just kind of bits and pieces of foods that they prefer, something that sounds good to them, and allow them to eat kind of at their leisure. But because this patient is unable to consume enough to satisfy their full amount of needs, that's why they're PEG tube dependent here. So looking at the current enteral prescription, this patient is getting 50 milliliters of formula every hour for 24 hours throughout the day. So if you do the quick math across, you'll see that that is 1,200 milliliters of that formula per day. Now, this whole next section is going to be reliant on this information. Because our patient has diabetes, they're on that carb-consistent formula. And then this is just the quick facts that we'll need to calculate whether or not this patient is getting enough calories, protein, and carbohydrates throughout the day. The carbohydrates, again, are going to be particularly important just due to the fact that we have a diabetic patient. So when we're looking to solve through how many calories they're getting from this formula, we can see that 1.2 kcals per mil that we saw over here can be related to our 1,200 milliliters per day. And we'll see with the math there that we're going to get 1,440 calories per day from that. If we move down to the protein here, our formula says it has 60 grams of protein per liter, and if we do our quick conversion here, you know how that there is 1,000 milliliters per liter, that's going to give us 1.2 liters per day of formula, which helps us in our conversion here, saying 1.2 liters per day, which will then give us a total of 72 grams of protein per day. When we're looking at carbohydrates here, we can see from our chart that 114.5 grams of carbs are provided per liter. Again, that's that 1.2 liters, and that will math out for us to be 137 grams of carbohydrate provided per day. So if you're looking at these numbers, you'll say to me, wow, that is certainly not enough to meet our needs. But if we remember back to the top here, we can see that our patient has limited oral intake. Okay, so if they have some oral intake, it's important for us to recognize how much they're being provided. So let me tell you. Through their oral intake, our patient is getting approximately 300 kcals extra per day, which is actually going to give us a total of 1740 kcals per day. In terms of protein, this patient is getting approximately 15 grams of protein orally every day, which is leading us to get to 87 grams of protein per day. And finally, for carbohydrates, we see that this patient is having about 30 grams of carbs through their oral diet every day, which is going to be 167 grams of carb per day. So, looking at what we had for the enteral prescription and the oral prescription, we can see that this patient is meeting their calorie needs, they are meeting their protein needs, and they're also meeting their carb needs. So, this is a good sign to us that the current enteral prescription is appropriate for this patient. Another thing to just keep in the back of your head, if you had a patient that was also on parenteral nutrition for some reason, you would need to contribute all of those needs into your overall provisions. So if you were calculating this, you would want to say, this is how much we're providing, this is how much calories, protein, carbs that we're giving to them, and that will help you also to make adjustments in the other factors that are going to lead into the total nutrition that you're providing to this patient. So now that we've determined that our enteral prescription and oral prescription combine to meet needs, we can expect that our oral prescription is probably going to stay pretty consistent, and we're going to utilize the number that we found for our enteral prescription to then make this transition to bolus. Some of the things we might need to think about in terms of bolus feed is, was our patient stable on continuous feeds? This patient was said to be on a continuous peg tube feeding, without any mention of any GI upset or extensive diarrhea or very out of control blood sugar levels. We can probably predict that this patient was fairly stable on continuous feeds. But if you had a patient that was having some difficulties, they may not be appropriate to quite yet transition to bolus feeds. The second thing to consider when you might be moving them to a bolus feed is, where are you feeding them at? Remember, we talked about how this patient has a peg tube. When you're feeding directly to the stomach, you have the ability to provide a greater amount of formula at one time due to the fact that the stomach is a reservoir and it's meant to have a larger volume at one time to slowly digest and then feed into the intestinal tract. When you're considering the intestines, if we were feeding lower in the GI tract, they do not have the same reservoir ability, and they also don't have the ability to do the same level of digestion that the stomach can provide. So, if you're feeding lower in the GI tract, a patient is not appropriate for bolus feeds in most cases, mostly due to the volume factor. And so if we're seeing a patient that is not being fed directly to the stomach through an NG tube or a peg tube, we don't really want to recommend them for bolus feeds. The last thing that you need to consider is whether or not this patient is in the right condition to be able to be provided with bolus feeds. Again, this patient has type 2 diabetes, so if we're looking at this patient's diabetes, are they having appropriate blood sugars? Do they need to be treated for lows and or highs throughout the day? And what might bolus do if we transition them off of the continuous feed and the consistent carbohydrate that is provided to them throughout the day? So again, because we didn't see any notes on this patient of really wonky blood sugar levels, we are probably appropriate to move to bolus as long as we appropriately place the bolus throughout the day to allow them to get some carbohydrates at a consistent rate to make sure that their blood sugars don't go too low. So again, that's going to be regarding any chronic or acute condition. We just need to take those into consideration before we say, oh yeah, let's just move to bolus. So, because this patient is meeting their needs through their enteral prescription and oral prescription, and because we've said that they're stable and continuous, they have appropriate feeding access points, and their current condition would allow for them to move to bolus, we can now start our calculations. So the number that I want you to hold on to here is going to be this number, this 1,200 milliliters per day, or 1.2 liters per day. So let's go ahead and clear the screen, and then we'll get started on some more calculations. Okay, so now that I've gotten us a little more room so we can write out some more calculations here, we're actually going to focus primarily here on this enteral feed of that consistent carbohydrate formula. So when we're first thinking about bolus feeds, we really want to ensure that our patient is going to get an appropriate amount. So because we already looked at the needs and we said that 1,200 milliliters a day was a good choice for them, we can then move forward with that 1,200 milliliters. Normally when I move someone to bolus, I like to consider whether or not they're going to be moving towards home and out of the hospital with this. So in a hospital, if you recall, there are these big liters, 1 liter containers of formula that are provided to our patients, okay? So those are going to be on drips or pumps, and they're just going to stay attached and can hang for 24 hours for this patient, okay? So at home, when a patient leaves us, they're more likely to move to a little can that's actually 8 fluid ounces, which, if you want that in milliliters, is 237 milliliters. Okay, so when our patient moves to that 237 milliliter can, we need to kind of help them out and say, well, how can we do this in measures of cans? Using a measure of cans or half cans is normally an easy way for our patients to kind of gain better understanding of what they'll be providing themselves, specifically if them or a caregiver is going to be handling their enteral feeds at home. So when I like to do this, I like to think about, okay, if I'm giving 1,200 milliliters per day, well, how many cans am I going to be giving if one can has 237 milliliters in it? So that's going to allow me to determine that it's approximately 5 cans. So we do need to kind of have some wiggle room there just because we don't want to say 5.4 cans. That's really difficult for our patients to interpret. So because I'm saying it's about 5 cans, it's then important for me to determine what are we actually providing for them. Okay, so I'll just tell you the breakdown real quick here so you don't have to walk through the math again. But 5 cans is going to give us 1,185 milliliters of this formula. Now, if you go back and look at what our formula provided, it will give you that 1.2 kcals per milliliter, which gives us 1,422 kcals per day. It'll also provide 71 grams of protein per day to our patient and 136 grams of carb. So by moving over to cans alone and saying that I estimate about 5 cans a day, that's going to give us this total volume as well as the energy, protein, and carbohydrates provided. So just in case you were wondering, to make sure our patient is still meeting their needs, we can add our 300 kcals from oral, which is going to give us that 1722. We can also add in that 15 grams of protein, which is going to give us 86 grams here. And we can also add in the 30 grams of carb, which is going to give us 166 grams. Okay, so if you look up at our needs here, you'll see that we just meet the energy needs, we meet the protein needs, and we meet the carbohydrate needs, okay? So by providing 5 cans per day, we're still going to meet those patient needs. We have 2 last steps that we need to deal with to ensure that our patient is going to get enough. The first of those steps is looking at the DRI for micronutrients. When you look at formulas, they typically list a certain number of milliliters necessary for that patient to meet the DRI. For this formula, that's 1,250 milliliters necessary for this patient to get all of their micronutrients. But when we're looking at how much we provided to this patient, you can see right here that we provided a little under that 1,250 milliliters per day. But I do think that being that our patient still has some oral intake here in this category, we can likely assume that this patient will get the remaining micronutrients from their oral intake, being that we're very few amount of milliliters off from that, and the oral intake should provide some additional support there. If this patient is still of concern in terms of micronutrients, you are welcome at your own discretion to consider providing a multivitamin or multimineral. But from our standpoint today for this case study, I'm going to say we're doing okay in terms of the DRI. So the final piece of the puzzle here is going to be our fluid recommendations. For this patient, if we think all the way back to their original file there, it didn't say anything about needing a fluid restriction of any variety. So I'm going to guess that this patient's fluid needs are probably going to be about 1 milliliter of fluid for every 1 kcal, which is going to put their needs between 1,700 and 1,800 milliliters of fluid. Okay, so when we're thinking about that, we then need to say to ourselves, all right, well, what are they going to get from the formula that's being provided? It's obviously liquid and will certainly provide some free water. So for this formula, we are providing 1.185 liters of formula through our 5 cans a day, and most of the time they will tell you milliliters of free water that are provided per each liter of formula. So for this equation, this formula has 805 milliliters of free water per liter of formula. So that's going to give us a total of 954 milliliters of free water. I'm going to go ahead and round that to 950 milliliters just to make that a little easier math for me. I'm going to make my goal right in the middle of our 2 milliliter points, saying that our goal is 1,750 milliliters of fluid per day, of that free water per day. And then from that, I'm going to subtract out the 950 milliliters that they're getting per day from formula. This will leave me with a remainder of 800 milliliters of free water that's needed. So one of the things about bolus feeding is it's not going to be a continuous flow of formula in the tube, so it's important to flush the tube with clear water before and after the feedings. So this is pretty standard practice at most hospitals, but you may have specific recommendations depending on the patient and or the hospital protocols. The amount that people will send through of clear water will depend, again, on the needs for the patient as well as the hospital protocols, but it's very likely that they'll probably have about 30 milliliters of fluid, clear water in specific, flushed through the line before and following. Most of the time this is very important for the following the bolus to ensure that the patient has all of the formula flushed out of their tubing. This will decrease the amount of sugar that's remaining in the tube, which can lead to infection and other concerns. So by flushing it, it can help ensure that the patient's getting all the formula that was remaining in the tube and also lowering that risk of infection as well. So for this patient, we're going to assume that they're going to get this 30 milliliters of free water before and after. So that's 60 milliliters total per feed of free water. So for their bolus recommendations, I want to lay out a few different things for them. First of all, we're going to confirm the formula, which is that consistent carb formula. And with that formula, the volume that I'd like for them to get each day is 5 cans. So with the 5 cans, we now need to say to them, what's our frequency? With 5 cans, I find it to be easy to provide a patient with 1 can or 1.5 cans or something like that at a time to keep it very simple as a whole or a half a can. So for this patient, being that they're diabetic, I am a little concerned about them getting an adequate amount of carbohydrate distributed throughout the day. So if possible, I would actually consider 5 feeds per day to be pretty appropriate for this person. So that again is going to be based on what the patient's willing to do and what you think based on your clinical judgment is most appropriate for your specific patient. So with multiple feeds throughout the day, I do find it helpful to provide our patients with time recommendations. With these time recommendations, it'll help them to understand how they need to disperse their feeds throughout the day so that they don't overload their bodies, get too full, and specifically for this patient with diabetes, overwhelm their body with too much carbohydrate at one time. So for this patient, my time recommendations included 8 a.m., 11 a.m., 2 p.m., 5 p.m., and 8 p.m. So these are all spaced 3 hours apart to try and allow this patient to get a smattering of carbohydrate throughout the day, but that could change based on the fact that some patients will still eat some oral meals. So if they were eating a ton at 5 p.m., maybe we wouldn't want to do their bolus and have them eat orally at that time. So again, if you had a patient, you could talk to them about that as well. Now to come back to our free water here. So if I'm telling you we're going to have 5 feeds per day, then our 60 milliliters times 5 is going to equal 300 milliliters of free water from flushes. So if we subtract the 300 from our 800, that equals 500 milliliters of free water that's still available for our patient to consume. So assuming that our patient can swallow safely and is able to consume orally, I'm going to say that 500 milliliters is probably an adequate amount for this person to want to drink on a daily basis. So I would say I would watch closely to see what this patient is consuming and make sure that they are drinking some fluid throughout the day, but I would bank on this patient probably getting the remainder of their fluid needs from what they're having orally for leisure. Hopefully this calculation set was not too confusing and was helpful for you to understand many of the different things that we may consider when trying to make bolus recommendations for our patients. Thanks for sticking around and watching with me today, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.